Hey guys, tonight we are sailing back to the early 1700s, a time when powdered wigs were high fashion, naval battles were the Netflix binge of kings, and apparently an ear could start a war. Yes, you heard that right. Tonight's story begins with a single, severed human ear. On one side, we have Great Britain, master of trade, tea, and self-confidence. On the other, Spain, equally proud, fiercely protective of its colonies in the Americas, and not particularly fond of British smugglers sneaking around their Caribbean holdings. What sparked the conflict? Well, imagine a routine patrol at sea. In 1731, a Spanish Coast Guard stopped a British ship commanded by Captain Robert Jenkins. Tensions were already high over accusations of smuggling and piracy, and in the chaos, a Spanish officer sliced off Jenkins's ear. He reportedly held up the bloody thing and said something along the lines of, "Take this to your king." 8 years later, Jenkins literally did just that, walking into the British Parliament with his dried up ear preserved in a jar, because nothing screams diplomatic incident like presenting your co-workers with body parts. The outrage was electric. British politicians saw an opportunity to rally the public and, conveniently, to challenge Spanish dominance in the Caribbean. The result, a war that would stretch across oceans, last nearly a decade, and eventually blend into an even bigger European conflict. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and unlucky bystanders would die in battles and from disease, and yet very little would actually change by the end. What makes this war so absurd is that it began over something so small and personal, a single ear, but spiraled into a massive, sprawling conflict. It's like starting a bar fight over spilled beer and somehow ending up with 2 entire cities on fire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Did you know about this battle before? If not, drop a comment after you hear how it really went down. Ready, let's drop into tonight's story. Things are about to get weird. The Atlantic in the 1730s was a chessboard of empires. Britain and Spain weren't just trading goods, they were also trading insults, accusations, and occasional cannonballs. Spain's colonies stretched like a golden chain across the Americas, guarding the flow of silver and sugar back to Europe. Britain, ever eager to expand, wanted a bigger slice of that lucrative pie. Officially, the two nations were at peace, thanks to treaties that tried and mostly failed to regulate who could trade where. Unofficially, British merchants were constantly sneaking goods into Spanish territories, while Spanish coast guards, known as guardacostas, were constantly stopping ships and, let's just say, confiscating things. Jenkins's encounter wasn't unique. Plenty of British captains had rough run-ins with Spanish authorities. But Jenkins' case became political dynamite. When he presented his ear to Parliament in 1738, opposition politicians pounced. They painted Spain as a brutal aggressor and the government as weak for not standing up to them. One fiery member of Parliament supposedly declared, "What indignities must we suffer before we unsheathe the sword?" A line that sounds impressive until you remember it's about an ear in a jar. King George II wasn't thrilled about the idea of war. Wars are expensive, messy, and have a habit of ruining royal dinner parties. But public opinion was boiling over, and Britain's merchants were loudly demanding protection for their trade routes. The pro-war faction cleverly framed the conflict as a defense of British honor and economic freedom. Jenkins himself became a kind of reluctant celebrity, paraded around as living proof of Spanish cruelty. Imagine being famous because part of your head was missing not exactly the career path most people dream of. By late 1739, Britain declared war on Spain. The opening moves were dramatic. If not particularly well planned, the Royal Navy, confident in its superiority, began assembling fleets to attack Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. Spain, for its part, prepared to defend its colonies with a mix of regular troops, local militias, and as it turned out, tropical diseases that would do more damage than any cannon ever could. The early months saw a lot of bluster and very little coordination. British commanders argued over strategy. Politicians back home micromanaged decisions from across the ocean, and sailors spent more time battling scurvy than actual enemies. A bizarre historical footnote here, one of the first naval engagements involved a British squadron trying to surprise a small Spanish fort, only to find that the defenders had literally been warned by a priest's parrots. Historians still debate whether this story is true or just a sailor's tall tale, but either way, it perfectly captures the chaotic vibe of the opening phase. Back in London, newspapers fanned the flames of patriotism. Woodcut illustrations of Jenkins holding his jarred ear were plastered everywhere, inspiring everything from political cartoons to pub songs. It became a symbol half grotesque, half comical of Britain's supposed moral superiority. And because humans are weird, there was even a brief fad of people wearing fake ears as brooches to show their support for the war. As 1740 approached, Britain was ready to strike hard. Admiral Edward Vernon, a competent if somewhat vain officer, was given command of a fleet aimed at Spanish strongholds in the Caribbean. His first target, Portobello, a vital port on the coast of what is now Panama. It was here that Spain funneled its precious metals for shipment to Europe, and capturing it would be both a strategic win and a massive propaganda boost. But before Vernon could make his move, there was still the small matter of getting his forces into position, dealing with squabbling colonial governors, and figuring out how to keep thousands of sailors alive in sweltering tropical conditions. It was clear that the War of Jenkins' Ear wasn't going to be a neat, orderly affair. And so, as the fleet sailed, the stage was set, Britain with its ambitions and its navy, Spain with its fortified ports and suspicious parrots, and somewhere in the middle, one dried-up ear still floating in a jar, the strangest war trophy in history. Back in London, the war was less about strategy and more about theater, and not the good kind where you get popcorn and a comfy seat. Parliament became a stage where politicians delivered dramatic speeches, waved their fists, and occasionally each other's paperwork. At the center of it all was Jenkins himself, the reluctant star. Picture this, a quiet, unassuming sea captain standing awkwardly before a packed room of politicians, holding up his dried, shriveled ear like a piece of evidence in a bizarre courtroom drama. One member of parliament actually fainted at the sight, though historians still argue whether it was from shock or simply a very tight corset. The rest gasped, groaned, and shouted for vengeance. This wasn't just about honor, though politics, like war, is rarely pure. The opposition party saw in Jenkins's ear a perfect opportunity to embarrass Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who was famous for his reluctance to go to war. Walpole's strategy was essentially, let's not blow everything up if we don't have to. Unfortunately, that doesn't play well with the public when you've got a severed body part making the rounds like a celebrity influencer. "Gentlemen," one fiery pro-war MP thundered, "shall we sit idly by while Spain mutilates our merchants and mocks our empire?" The crowd roared approval, probably imagining fleets of Spanish villains wielding swords and sinister mustaches. It was political theater at its finest, and like any good drama, it had props. The jarred ear sat on a table, casting a morbid shadow over the proceedings. Meanwhile, Walpole tried to stall. He argued for negotiations, for measured responses, for basically anything that didn't involve thousands of soldiers dying in tropical swamps. His enemies, however, painted him as weak, even cowardly. Cartoonists had a field day, depicting him hiding behind Jenkins or wearing an oversized ear like a hat. By mid-1739, public opinion had been whipped into a frothy, patriotic frenzy. London taverns echoed with toasts to Britain's inevitable victory. Pamphlets promised that Spanish colonies would soon be flying the Union Jack. Merchants, always quick to spot a profit, began investing heavily in shipping ventures, anticipating a boom once Spain's trade routes were smashed. It was as if the entire city had decided that war would be a quick, clean affair, a few naval battles, a triumphant march into Havana, and everyone home by Christmas. Spoiler alert, it would not be quick, or clean, or anything remotely like what they imagined. In Spain, the mood was equally tense, though far less theatrical. The Spanish crown viewed Britain as a meddlesome nuisance, constantly violating treaties and smuggling goods into their colonies. The loss of any key port would be a direct threat to their empire's lifeblood silver from the mines of the Americas. While Britain's parliament was yelling about ears, Spain's ministers were quietly reinforcing fortresses, stockpiling supplies, and perhaps most importantly, bracing for the onslaught of yellow fever and malaria that had been fighting wars in the Caribbean long before humans arrived. A quirky historical tidbit here around this time. Some Spanish commanders began referring to mosquitoes as our tiny allies, a joke with just enough truth to sting. These buzzing little monsters would eventually kill far more British soldiers than musket balls or cannon fire. As Britain prepared to send fleets across the Atlantic, they faced a logistical nightmare. Ships needed food, water, and fresh supplies for months at sea. Sailors were famously difficult to manage, prone to drunkenness, desertion, and the occasional knife fight over who got the last biscuit. Disease spread faster than orders, and by the time many ships reached the Caribbean, they were already half crippled by scurvy. This wasn't helped by the fact that Britain's military leadership couldn't agree on a strategy. Should they focus on capturing ports, raiding Spanish treasure ships, striking at Havana, the crown jewel of Spain's defenses in typical British fashion? They decided to do a little bit of everything, and predictably, to do it all badly. Admiral Edward Vernon, however, had no patience for dithering. He was a man of action, famous for introducing watered-down rum to the Navy, a concoction sailors nicknamed grog. Vernon believed that swift, decisive strikes were the key to victory. His first target was Portobello, a small but vital port on the Panamanian coast. If he could capture it with a relatively small force, he'd humiliate Spain and silence his critics back home. And in late 1739, that's exactly what he did. Vernon launched a daring nighttime attack with just 6 ships, catching the Spanish completely off guard. Within hours, Portobello fell. British casualties were minimal, Spanish resistance collapsed, and suddenly Britain had its first clear victory of the war. Back in London, the reaction was nothing short of euphoric. Bells rang out, crowds cheered, and Vernon was hailed as a national hero. Parliament even voted to issue a special commemorative medal, which awkwardly depicted the Spanish governor kneeling before Vernon like a supplicant. If there was ever a moment that guaranteed Spain's resolve to fight back, it was probably that little artistic flourish. This victory sparked a frenzy of overconfidence. Pubs renamed themselves after Portobello. Songs were written about Vernon's genius, and British newspapers declared that Spain's empire would soon crumble like stale shortbread. Some even suggested that the war might end within the year. But beneath the celebration, cracks were already forming. Vernon himself was uneasy. Portobello had been lightly defended, more a symbolic win than a strategic game changer. He knew that future battles wouldn't be so easy, especially against well-fortified cities like Cartagena. He also knew that his forces were dangerously underprepared for the brutal realities of campaigning in the tropics. Meanwhile, Spain seethed. The loss of Portobello was a humiliation, but it also served as a wake-up call. Spanish commanders began pouring reinforcements into their Caribbean defenses, determined to make the next British assault a bloody disaster, and they had helped the climate, the insects, and the sheer logistical challenge of moving European armies through jungles and swamps. Historians still debate whether Britain could have pressed its advantage after Portobello and ended the war quickly. Some argue that a bold strike on Havana might have broken Spain's Caribbean hold. Others believe Britain never had the resources or coordination to pull it off. What's certain is that they didn't try, and that hesitation would come back to haunt them. As 1740 dawned, both empires were fully committed. Britain, intoxicated by victory, prepared an even larger expedition. Spain, smarting from defeat, dug in for a fight to the death. And somewhere in the middle, sailors grumbled about grog rations, politicians sharpened their insults, and mosquitoes waited patiently for their feast. Spain, understandably furious over losing Portobello, wasn't about to let Britain dance around the Caribbean unopposed. In Madrid, ministers met under dim candlelight, glaring at maps covered in little wooden ship tokens. One official reportedly slammed his fist on the table and declared, "The British have insulted our honor and our empire." Another quickly added, "and our fort at Portobello," because apparently losing an actual fortification was slightly more serious than losing face. While Britain was busy congratulating itself, Spain began quietly reinforcing its remaining strongholds. Havana, Cartagena, and Santiago de Cuba became hives of activity. Engineers strengthened walls, carpenters built barricades, and local militias were whipped into shape, sometimes literally. Spanish commanders didn't just plan to defend, they planned to humiliate Britain in return. Back in London, however, reality and fantasy were still having a heated argument. The newspapers, still giddy from Portobello, treated Admiral Edward Vernon like a mix of military genius and rock star. Vernon's portrait appeared in taverns, pamphlets, and even on cheap tin buttons sold to eager fans. Pubs served a drink called Vernon's Victory Punch, which was mostly watered-down rum and a hint of lemon, essentially the naval grog Vernon had invented, but with better marketing. Politicians boasted that Britain would sweep the Spanish from the Caribbean entirely. Some even predicted Britain would annex Cuba by the summer. One particularly imaginative pamphlet claimed that Britain's navy was so mighty that Spanish ships would sink in terror merely at the sight of a British flag. Vernon himself wasn't so convinced. He understood the dirty little secret of the Portobello victory. It had been easy precisely because it wasn't important enough to be heavily defended. Capturing a small port at night was one thing. capturing a heavily fortified city like Cartagena that would require an army, a fleet, and a miracle or two. But London wasn't interested in cautious realism. Flush with public support and political pressure, they approved a massive new expedition. This one would dwarf Vernon's previous effort, combining thousands of soldiers, dozens of warships, and a plan that was, well, let's be generous and call it ambitious. Here's the fun part, Britain's plan relied on perfect coordination between the army and navy. This was a bold choice, considering that the two branches of the military hated each other almost as much as they hated the Spanish. Naval officers saw army officers as fussy landlubbers. Army officers saw naval officers as arrogant, rum-soaked loudmouths. The idea that they'd work seamlessly together was about as realistic as expecting a cat and a dog to co-author a symphony. While Britain assembled this super armada, Spain leaned on one of its most reliable weapons bureaucracy. Colonial officials argued endlessly over who was in charge, what supplies were needed, and whether certain cannons were facing the wrong direction. At one point, an entire shipment of gunpowder was delayed because someone had misfiled the request under powdered sugar. And yet, despite the chaos, Spanish preparations were deadly serious. Cartagena, a jewel of Spain's empire, became a fortress bristling with guns. Its defenders were led by Don Blas de Lezo, a one-eyed, one-legged, one-armed admiral who might as well have been a pirate king in all but name. His nickname, Half Man, was both literal and deeply misleading. He fought like three men rolled into one. While these titans prepared for battle, smaller clashes continued. British privateers harassed Spanish merchant ships, raiding their cargo holds for silver, sugar, and the occasional barrel of wine. Spanish guardacostas retaliated, capturing British smugglers and sometimes staging public hangings to send a message. Amid all this, regular sailors bore the brunt of the misery. Long voyages meant weeks of rotting food, foul water, and cramped sleeping quarters. Disease ran rampant. Scurvy swelled gums and loosened teeth. While dysentery, well, let's just say ship decks were not the cleanest places in the world. There's a bizarre piece of trivia here during this buildup. Some British sailors believed that drinking vinegar would prevent scurvy. It didn't. It just made everything taste awful. Historians still debate whether this rumor was started by well-meaning doctors or a particularly cruel ship's cook. By early 1741, Britain's mighty expedition was ready to set sail. It was a sight to behold, nearly 200 ships stretched across the horizon, carrying more than 25,000 men. It was, at the time, the largest force Britain had ever assembled for operations in the Americas. Crowds lined the shores to watch the departure, cheering as the sails billowed and drums beat out a martial rhythm. The press, naturally, declared this fleet unstoppable. One newspaper headline read, "Cartagena shall fall within weeks." Another simply printed a cartoon of a Spanish fort crumbling under a giant British boot. Meanwhile, Vernon himself sent cautious letters back to London, warning that victory was not guaranteed, but his words were drowned out by patriotic songs and wild speculation about how soon Havana would fall. Across the ocean, Don Blas de Lezo prepared his men with grim determination. He knew the British were coming, and he knew they would bring overwhelming numbers, but he also knew Cartagena's terrain, tides, and defenses far better than his enemies. The Spanish admiral famously gathered his troops and declared, "They may come with 100 ships, 1,000, or 10,000. We will fight them with whatever limbs we have left." It was a stirring speech, though perhaps a bit unsettling coming from a man who had already lost several limbs. Historians still argue about whether Spain's defensive preparations were truly brilliant or just desperately improvised. Some claim de Lezo's genius lay in exploiting the natural geography of Cartagena. Others think he simply got lucky with tides and disease. Whatever the case, he was about to face one of the most ambitious amphibious assaults of the entire century. Back in Britain, however, attention was turning inward. Parliament buzzed with arguments over who would claim credit for the expected victories. Merchants placed bets on which city would fall first. Ordinary citizens bought souvenirs shaped like Portobello's Fort Little ceramic models that would become awkward decorations when the war started going poorly. As the British fleet sailed south, a storm brewed, both literal and political. Clouds gathered over the Caribbean, rain lashed the decks, and sailors muttered about omens. Some swore they'd seen a ghostly figure on the waves, a phantom warning of doom. Others blamed too much grog. The stage was set for a clash that would determine the course of the war, or at least create a spectacular disaster for one side. Britain was riding high on victory fever, Spain was steeled for revenge, and somewhere between them, the ocean waited, full of sharks, storms, and the occasional confused parrot still warning towns of incoming fleets. When the British superfleet finally arrived off the coast of Cartagena in early 1741, it was like watching a massive, very expensive parade sail straight into a swamp. The ships were magnificent, shore-gleaming sails, towering masts, flags fluttering proudly, but they also carried thousands of men who were already hot, sweaty, and cranky from weeks at sea. It turns out that stuffing that many humans into wooden boxes with limited plumbing is a recipe for bad tempers and worse smells. Admiral Vernon, perched on the deck of his flagship, surveyed the glittering horizon with a mix of pride and worry. He had brought the biggest force Britain had ever sent to the Americas, and now all eyes were on him. His orders were to take Cartagena, a fortified city with layers of walls, forts, and tricky tidal patterns that could trap unwary ships. This was going to be a logistical nightmare, and Vernon knew it, unfortunately. Many of his officers were still coasting on the high of Portobello and assumed Cartagena would fall just as easily. Spoiler, it did not. On land, Don Blas de Lezo, the one-eyed, one-legged, one-armed Spanish admiral, prepared his defenses. His men adored him, partly because he was fearless and partly because anyone who could keep commanding after losing that many body parts was clearly not human. One British soldier reportedly described him as the most terrifying man I've ever seen, and that includes my mother-in-law. De Lezo's plan was simple but brilliant, used the geography of Cartagena to his advantage. Narrow channels forced British ships into choke points. Swampy ground bogged down infantry. And most importantly, tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria were already working as invisible allies. The British opened their campaign with a thunderous naval bombardment. Cannons roared, smoke filled the air, and entire sections of Cartagena's outer walls crumbled under the barrage. The initial assault looked promising, and cheers rang out across the British fleet. But then reality kicked in. As troops attempted to land, they encountered fierce resistance from Spanish soldiers and local militias. Musket fire rattled through the mangroves. British officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the chaos. Boats ran aground on hidden sandbars, leaving soldiers to wade through waist-deep muck while trying not to drop their muskets. And then the heat hit them. British troops, dressed in heavy wool uniforms designed for European climates, were completely unprepared for the Caribbean's sweltering humidity. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Their powdered wigs wilted in the sun, giving them a distinctly tragic look. Imagine an army of sweaty poodles charging into battle. As if that weren't bad enough, swarms of mosquitoes descended on the invaders. Within days, yellow fever began spreading through the British camp. Sailors who had survived storms and cannon fire now fell victim to fevers, delirium, and, in some cases, bizarre hallucinations. One soldier swore he saw Don Blas de Lezo's missing leg hopping through the camp like some kind of cursed relic. Historians still debate whether this was a fever dream or just bad rum. Vernon tried to maintain momentum. He ordered a direct assault on the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas, the key to Cartagena's defenses. The plan required coordination between the Navy and Army, which, as previously mentioned, was about as likely as a synchronized swimming routine between cats and dogs. The result was chaos. The Navy bombarded the fort too early, alerting the defenders. The Army advanced without ladders tall enough to scale the walls, a rather important detail someone had apparently overlooked. Spanish defenders poured musket fire and grenades down on the attackers. At one point, a British officer reportedly shouted, retreat only for his men to mishear it as charge, leading to a brief, disastrous surge forward. De Lezo, despite his injuries, personally oversaw the defense. Legend has it he stood atop the walls, waving his sword and shouting insults so colorful that British translators refused to repeat them. His presence rallied the defenders, while the British faltered under withering fire and rising casualties. Then came the final, crushing blow rain. Tropical downpours turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. Gunpowder grew damp and unreliable. Soldiers slipped and fell, their uniforms caked in muck. Supply lines broke down as carts sank into the mud. Even the ships offshore struggled, their sails battered by sudden squalls. Disease, exhaustion, and sheer confusion did what the Spanish guns alone could not. The British offensive ground to a halt. By mid-April, Vernon had no choice but to retreat. His once mighty army was now a staggering collection of sick, wounded, and demoralized men. Out of the 25,000 troops who had set sail, nearly half were dead or incapacitated not from combat, but from disease and starvation. The defeat at Cartagena was catastrophic. British newspapers, which had once printed heroic cartoons of Vernon stomping Spanish forts, now scrambled to explain the disaster. Some blamed the army, others blamed the navy, many blamed the weather, a few even blamed Jenkins' ear, suggesting the war had been cursed from the start. Back in London, Parliament erupted in finger-pointing. Walpole's critics gleefully declared that the war was mismanaged. Vernon's supporters claimed he had been sabotaged by incompetent generals. The generals, in turn, accused the Navy of failing to support them. It was like a dysfunctional family argument, except with empires and thousands of lives at stake. Meanwhile, Spain celebrated. Cartagena became a symbol of resistance and heroism. Don Blas de Lezo, though gravely ill from his own wounds and the tropical climate, was hailed as a national hero. Sadly, he would die just months later, likely from disease, a cruel twist of fate given how instrumental disease had been in defeating the British. Today, historians still debate whether Britain ever had a real chance of taking Cartagena. Some argue that better planning and timing might have secured victory. Others believe it was doomed from the start, given the climate, the terrain, and the sheer logistical nightmare of moving thousands of men across the ocean. One thing is certain, the battle marked a turning point. Britain's dream of sweeping Spain from the Caribbean evaporated. The war would drag on for years. But from this point forward, it was less about glorious conquests and more about survival, attrition, and trying not to die of mosquito bites. As the battered British fleet limped home, Vernon reportedly stared out at the horizon and muttered, "Well, that could have gone better." Understatement of the century. The news of Britain's crushing defeat at Cartagena spread across the Atlantic like wildfire, or perhaps more like a very smelly fog. In London, the atmosphere flipped almost overnight from jubilation to utter disbelief. This was supposed to have been the glorious conquest that cemented Britain's dominance in the Caribbean. Instead, the largest expedition in British colonial history had returned home in tatters, with more men lost to disease than to actual fighting. The reaction was, in a word, messy. First came the scramble to control the narrative. Politicians who had cheered the war now rushed to distance themselves from the fiasco. Pamphlets that once hailed Admiral Vernon as a genius were quietly pulled from shelves, replaced by pointed questions like, who let this disaster happen? Vernon's commemorative medals, the ones showing the Spanish governor kneeling, suddenly felt awkward, like giving someone a trophy for a race they didn't finish. In taverns, ordinary Londoners muttered darkly into their pints. Rumors swirled about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the weather, claiming tropical storms had doomed the expedition. Others blamed the generals for incompetence, or the Navy for failing to deliver supplies. One popular theory suggested the whole thing was cursed because of Jenkins's ear, apparently. Bringing a preserved body part into Parliament had upset some ancient maritime spirits. Historians tend to dismiss this explanation, but at the time, it had surprising traction. Meanwhile, Vernon himself returned to Britain to a deeply mixed reception. On one hand, he had captured Portobello earlier in the war and was still something of a hero to his supporters. On the other, Cartagena had been a humiliating defeat that couldn't easily be spun away. His enemies in Parliament wasted no time tearing into him, accusing him of arrogance, poor planning, and possibly excessive grog consumption. Walpole, the prime minister who had reluctantly been dragged into war, suddenly found himself under relentless attack. His opponents painted him as weak for not fully backing the campaign, while his allies argued he'd been forced into a war he never wanted. It was a political feeding frenzy, with Jenkins's ear sitting metaphorically and sometimes literally at the center of the debate. Amid all this finger-pointing, the actual war didn't stop. Britain still had naval forces in the Caribbean, and Spain wasn't about to let its guard down. Smaller battles flared up across the region as both sides tried to regain momentum. British privateers continued raiding Spanish merchant ships, while Spanish guardacostas harassed British traders. It was less a grand campaign now and more a series of ugly, scattered skirmishes. Disease, however, remained the true victor. Yellow fever and malaria didn't care which flag you served under. Entire garrisons were wiped out without a single shot being fired. Ships became floating hospitals, and not in a good way. Sailors would return to port with barely enough crew left to sail the vessel, their decks littered with the sick and the dead. One bizarre historical tidbit emerged during this time. Some British commanders began carrying garlic as a supposed cure for disease. The logic was that its strong smell would ward off bad airs, a popular medical theory of the time. In reality, it just made the already foul-smelling ships even worse. There are accounts of sailors refusing to enter certain cabins because the stench of garlic and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. While the Caribbean theater slogged on, attention began to shift back to Europe. The war, which had started as a localized conflict over trade rights in one unlucky sea captain's ear, was beginning to merge with a much larger struggle brewing on the continent, the War of Austrian Succession. This was a problem for Britain because it meant resources and troops were suddenly being stretched thin. The focus moved away from colonial adventures and toward defending allies and interests closer to home. The grand vision of sweeping Spain from the Americas faded into the background as European politics took center stage. For the men still stationed in the Caribbean, however, this shift felt like abandonment. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements were slow to arrive, and morale plummeted. British soldiers grumbled that they were being left to rot in swamps, while the politicians back home debated treaties and titles. Spanish forces, better acclimated to the environment, slowly regained the upper hand. The failure of the Cartagena expedition also had ripple effects beyond the battlefield. British merchants, who had invested heavily in the expectation of new trade routes opening up, suffered massive financial losses. Insurance rates for shipping skyrocketed. Some companies went bankrupt. The initial patriotic fervor was replaced by a grim sense of economic reality. Historians still argue about whether Britain could have salvaged the war effort at this point. Some believe that a bold, decisive strike perhaps on Havana or another key port might have turned the tide. Others argue that disease and logistics made such victories impossible. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, tangled up in the chaotic mix of ambition, incompetence, and sheer bad luck. What's certain is that the War of Jenkins's ear was no longer a shiny, exciting crusade. It had become a quagmire, literal and figurative, where men died in droves for objectives that seemed increasingly meaningless. Back in London, the public grew restless. The songs celebrating Portobello now sounded hollow. Parliament sessions grew heated, with shouting matches and even the occasional thrown wig. Walpole's government tottered under the strain, and his political enemies sharpened their knives. Through it all, Jenkins himself remained oddly silent. The man whose ear had started it all faded into the background, perhaps realizing that history was a fickle beast. There's no record of him ever trying to capitalize on his fame. In fact, some sources suggest he retired quietly, his preserved ear stored away in a box, a grim reminder of how one small incident can spiral into chaos. As 1742 dawned, Britain faced a sobering reality. They were no closer to victory than when the war began. And now they had to fight on two fronts. The dream of easy conquest in the Caribbean had evaporated, leaving only disease, debt, and disappointment. The war had started with a severed ear. Now it was threatening to tear apart the very fabric of Britain's political and military establishment. And somewhere, in a jar gathering dust, that ear was probably laughing, while Britain was licking its wounds and Parliament was busy screaming at itself. Spain decided it was time to go on the offensive, or at least to make sure Britain didn't get another lucky break. The victory at Cartagena had energized the Spanish Empire, turning Don Blas de Lezo into a national legend. Even though he didn't live long enough to bask in the glory, his defense had proven that Spain could hold its ground in the Caribbean, but Spain wasn't content to merely defend anymore. From Havana to Veracruz, Spanish commanders started sending out privateers and warships to disrupt British trade. These weren't carefully orchestrated campaigns, but rather a flurry of quick strikes and opportunistic raids. It was guerrilla warfare on the high seas, fueled by equal parts anger and rum. British merchants quickly discovered that sailing the Caribbean now meant risking both your cargo and your neck. Insurance premiums went through the roof. Meanwhile, Britain scrambled to rebuild its shattered reputation. Admiral Vernon was still a household name, though now in the same way that a particularly bad chef might be famous for poisoning an entire banquet. His supporters insisted that Cartagena hadn't been his fault. They blamed the army for incompetence, the weather for turning against them, and, bizarrely, even the local crabs for somehow sabotaging landings. And in some sense, they weren't entirely wrong. Disease continued to be the biggest killer. Yellow fever was the invisible general who needed no gunpowder. In some campaigns, entire regiments disappeared within weeks, not from battle, but from fevers that turned strong men into delirious wrecks. Spanish soldiers suffered too, of course, but having been raised in the climate, they had a slight edge in survival. Despite Britain's early disaster, 1741 wasn't all bad news. Vernon managed to capture a few minor islands and ports, mostly the ones Spain had neglected to defend properly. These victories were loudly trumpeted back home as proof that the war wasn't a total failure. London newspapers ran exaggerated headlines like, "Vernon triumphs again," while carefully omitting the part about the captured town having more chickens than soldiers. As the war dragged into its third year, the dynamic began to shift. The focus was no longer solely on the Caribbean. Europe itself was heating up. In 1740, the Austrian Emperor Charles VI had died without a male heir, plunging the continent into a frenzy over who would control his vast domains. This became the War of Austrian Succession, a conflict so complicated it made the Jenkins Ear War look like a neighborhood spat over a fence. Britain suddenly found itself drawn into a much larger fight. Now, they weren't just battling Spain, they were also up against France, who had joined Spain as an ally. On paper, Britain had powerful friends too, like Austria and the Dutch Republic, but alliances in this period were as stable as a three-legged stool on a windy day. This created a bizarre situation. The war over one man's ear was now part of a grand European struggle involving dynasties, marriages, and maps being redrawn every other month. For the soldiers slogging through Caribbean mud, this was deeply confusing. Imagine being told you were fighting to avenge Captain Jenkins, only to find out you were suddenly defending an Austrian princess's inheritance. It's no wonder morale was plummeting. The British government, desperate to keep public support, tried to spin this expansion of the war as a heroic stand for liberty and balance of power. Pamphlets spoke of defending the rights of Europe, a noble cause. If you ignored the fact that most of the fighting still revolved around sugar, silver, and who controlled which profitable islands. Back in the Caribbean, Spain had its own problems. Supplies were stretched thin, communication with Madrid was painfully slow, and local officials often argued more with each other than with the British. Corruption was rampant. There are accounts of Spanish officers selling gunpowder on the black market, only for that very gunpowder to be used by British privateers a few weeks later. Still, the Spanish had one unbeatable advantage: home turf. Their forts were built to withstand sieges, their sailors knew the tricky waters, and their soldiers didn't drop like flies the moment a mosquito buzzed by. The fighting remained brutal but small scale. A British ship might raid a coastal town, only to be ambushed by Spanish cutters on the way out. A Spanish convoy might sneak through a blockade at night, delivering desperately needed supplies to a garrison. Both sides exaggerated their successes in reports to their governments, creating an endless loop of half-truths and wishful thinking. One particularly strange incident occurred in 1743 when a British privateer captured a Spanish sloop near Cuba. Inside the cabin, they reportedly found a handwritten letter complaining about the shortage of rum rations. The British captain, amused, added a note of his own mocking the complaint and then sent the letter back to the Spanish with a messenger. Historians still debate whether this was an early form of trolling or simply very weird diplomacy. As the Caribbean theater simmered, Europe erupted. Battles on land involved tens of thousands of troops, with cities changing hands every few months. France's entry into the war complicated everything for Britain. Now they had to split their naval forces between protecting trade routes and blockading French ports. This diluted their strength, leaving the Caribbean more vulnerable than ever. Spain, sensing an opportunity, launched a few limited offensives of its own. While they never achieved a knockout blow, they managed to keep Britain off balance. The dream of a decisive British victory faded further into the distance. By the mid-1740s, everyone involved was exhausted. Troops were sick, treasuries were empty, and politicians were running out of ways to blame each other. The war had started over a single ear. But now it sprawled across continents, touching nearly every major power in Europe and the Americas. And yet, for all this chaos, very little had actually changed. The same islands were fought over repeatedly, the same ports were captured and recaptured. It was as if both sides were stuck in a bizarre, bloody loop, except with fewer rules and more mosquitoes. The absurdity wasn't lost on contemporary observers. One British satirist wrote, "We fight, we bleed, we sail, we drown, and yet the map remains the same." It was a bleak but accurate assessment of a war that seemed determined to go nowhere fast. As 1745 approached, a strange sort of stalemate set in. Neither side could win decisively, but neither could afford to quit. And so the war continued, grinding on like a badly wound clock, fueled by inertia, politics, and just enough stubborn pride to keep the cannons firing. By 1745, the War of Jenkins's ear had become less about Captain Jenkins, his unfortunate ear, or even the Caribbean itself. It was now just another messy strand woven into the tangled knot of the War of Austrian Succession. What had begun as a localized spat over smuggling rights had ballooned into a sprawling global conflict involving half of Europe and most of the Atlantic world. The Caribbean, once the shiny centerpiece of Britain's ambitions, was now more of an exhausting sideshow. In London, political tensions reached a fever pitch. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who had never wanted this war in the first place, was practically shouting "I told you so" while simultaneously trying to avoid being blamed for the disaster. His opponents gleefully blamed him for everything, from the Cartagena catastrophe to the rising price of sugar. Parliament debates turned so heated that witnesses described wigs being thrown like snowballs, and one MP actually toppling over a bench while shouting about naval logistics. Walpole's downfall seemed inevitable, and indeed, by early 1742 he was forced to resign. His departure didn't magically fix Britain's problems, but it did shift the blame game. Now his successors had to figure out how to continue fighting a war they had inherited, like being handed a half-finished puzzle where someone had already eaten the corner pieces. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, British soldiers and sailors lived in a state of perpetual misery. Supplies were scarce, pay was delayed, ships leaked, uniforms rotted, and the ever-present mosquitoes buzzed like tiny flying executioners. British commanders still dreamed of decisive victories, but their troops were too sick and exhausted to carry out grand plans. Spain, for its part, was faring only slightly better. Its colonial garrisons were stretched thin, and supply ships from Europe often arrived late or not at all. Thanks to British blockades, local governors bickered constantly over priorities. There's a recorded instance of two Spanish officials arguing so fiercely about whether to reinforce a fort or a port that they stopped speaking to each other for 3 months. And then there was France. By joining Spain's side, France added a whole new layer of chaos to the mix. French warships began appearing in the Caribbean, complicating Britain's already strained naval strategy. France also opened new fronts in Europe, forcing Britain to divert ships and troops away from the Americas. This shift had real consequences. Suddenly, British commanders in the Caribbean couldn't count on reinforcements or supplies arriving on time, if at all. They had to rely on local resources, which were both limited and expensive. Desperate for food, some British garrisons resorted to raiding nearby plantations, creating friction with colonial civilians who were supposed to be their allies. As the war expanded, its original purpose grew murkier. Ordinary soldiers began questioning what they were fighting for. Was this still about Jenkins's ear, about defending trade rights, or were they now just pawns in a much larger European chess game? The confusion sapped morale. One diary from a British privateer captured the mood perfectly. "Today we chased a Spanish sloop for 3 hours, caught it. Found only 4 men aboard and 1 parrot. The parrot cursed us in Spanish. We returned to port. I am beginning to suspect this war has no point." In London, the public was equally bewildered. Newspapers struggled to explain why Britain was now fighting battles in Bavaria and Flanders, thousands of miles from the Caribbean. Satirists had a field day. One cartoon depicted a giant ear wearing a crown, stomping across a map of Europe while tiny soldiers scattered in every direction. Despite the growing absurdity, the war dragged on, money flowed like water, and both empires sank deeper into debt. Ships were built, sunk, and replaced in an endless cycle. The same islands changed hands repeatedly, sometimes in the same year. At one point, a British officer joked that he'd fought for the same fort 3 times and still didn't know which flag would be flying next week. Historians still debate whether Britain ever had a real strategy during these middle years of the war. Some argue that the government was simply reacting to events. lurching from one crisis to the next. Others believe there was a coherent plan buried under layers of bad luck and worse leadership. What's clear is that Spain, despite its own problems, managed to hold on to most of its key territories. Cartagena remained firmly in Spanish hands. Havana stood strong. The tiny allies' mosquitoes and disease continued to do their gruesome work. Meanwhile, British politicians began to realize that public enthusiasm for the war was fading. The initial excitement over avenging Jenkins' ear had long since evaporated. Now, all the public saw were mounting costs and unclear results. Taxes rose, trade suffered, and merchants grumbled loudly. To distract from the growing discontent, Britain's government leaned heavily on propaganda. Pamphlets extolled the bravery of British sailors. Artists painted dramatic scenes of naval battles where British ships always looked larger and cleaner than reality. One popular play portrayed Admiral Vernon as a swashbuckling hero who single-handedly defeated the entire Spanish Navy, a performance that probably made Vernon himself cringe. Behind the scenes, though, politicians were quietly looking for a way out. The war was proving too costly to continue indefinitely. Even the most hawkish members of parliament began whispering about peace negotiations, though no one wanted to be the first to suggest it publicly. By 1746, the writing was on the wall. Britain had not achieved its original goals. Spain had been bloodied but not broken. France was still a formidable enemy. And the map of the Caribbean looked almost exactly the same as it had when the war began. The War of Jenkins' Ear, once sold as a quick, decisive conflict, was now just another endless war of attrition. The question was no longer who will win, but when will this madness finally stop? By 1747, the War of Jenkins' Ear had transformed into something so sprawling and complicated that even experienced diplomats couldn't keep track of who was fighting whom and why. What had started as a localized naval dispute over smuggling and maritime rights had fully merged into the much grander War of Austrian Succession. Think of it like this: Jenkins' ear was a small campfire, and the War of Austrian Succession was a raging forest blaze. By this point, Britain, Spain, France, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, and pretty much everyone with a crown and an army were throwing logs on the fire, and no one could remember who had started it or whether anyone was still roasting marshmallows. For Britain, this meant juggling multiple theaters of war at once. In Europe, massive land battles were unfolding across Germany and Italy. At sea, the Royal Navy was stretched to its limits, tasked with protecting trade routes, blockading enemy ports, and ferrying troops to far-flung colonies. The Caribbean, once the primary focus of Britain's war effort, now competed for attention and resources with a dozen other urgent fronts. This shift was particularly devastating for the soldiers and sailors still stationed in the West Indies. Supplies became sporadic, reinforcements were delayed, and pay often failed to arrive altogether. In some garrisons, British troops were reduced to eating whatever they could find, including, reportedly, a particularly aggressive breed of iguana that tasted like a cross between chicken and disappointment. Spanish forces faced their own hardships, but they had a critical advantage. They were defending their home turf. Their forts were built to last. Their sailors knew the treacherous currents, and their soldiers were less likely to keel over from the first mosquito bite. They also had help from their French allies, whose ships began patrolling Caribbean waters in increasing numbers. This complicated Britain's naval strategy. Now, instead of focusing solely on Spain, British commanders had to contend with French squadrons popping up unexpectedly, ambushing convoys and disrupting blockades. At one point, a British captain reportedly mistook a French fleet for a group of friendly merchants, a mistake he only realized when they opened fire and sent him scrambling for safety. As the war expanded, its absurdity deepened. Many of the soldiers fighting in the Caribbean had no idea what was happening in Europe, and vice versa. A British grenadier stationed in Havana might have been told he was defending trade rights, while a French musketeer fighting in Flanders believed he was securing a royal inheritance. Neither man knew or cared about Jenkins or his infamous ear. Even back in London, public understanding of the war grew hazy. The newspapers were filled with conflicting reports. One day, Britain was supposedly on the brink of total victory. The next day, a fresh defeat would erase those hopes. Satirical pamphlets mocked the chaos, with one cartoon showing a giant, disembodied ear sailing around the world, pursued by confused soldiers from 6 different countries. The financial toll was staggering. Wars are expensive even under the best of circumstances, and this one was a global affair. Britain's national debt soared. Taxes rose sharply, causing unrest at home. Merchants who had once cheered for war now cursed it, as their ships were sunk, seized, or endlessly delayed by bureaucratic red tape. Spain, too, felt the strain. Their empire was vast but brittle, and keeping distant colonies supplied during wartime was a logistical nightmare. Spanish officials bickered over priorities. Should they reinforce Havana, Cartagena, or Veracruz? Every decision was a gamble, and mistakes were costly. Despite all this, there were occasional flashes of success and failure on both sides. In 1747, a British fleet scored a decisive victory against the French near Cape Finisterre, securing valuable shipping lanes. But in the Caribbean, Spain managed to fend off several British raids, proving that their defensive strategy was working. One particularly bizarre episode occurred that same year when a British force attempted to capture a small, strategically unimportant island. They succeeded, only to abandon it 2 weeks later after realizing they couldn't survive on the island's limited resources. The only lasting outcome was a heated argument over whether the chickens they'd eaten during their stay should be classified as spoils of war. Historians still debate whether Britain ever had a coherent plan for the Caribbean during these years. Some believe the goal was simply to keep Spain tied down, preventing them from sending reinforcements to Europe. Others argue Britain was waiting for a decisive moment to strike a knockout blow, a moment that never came. As the war dragged on, fatigue set in across all fronts. Soldiers grew disillusioned, civilians grew restless, even politicians, who had once been eager for glory, began whispering about peace behind closed doors. Diplomats from various nations started exchanging cautious feelers, exploring what a settlement might look like. But publicly, everyone kept up appearances. Britain continued to boast of its naval power. Spain vowed to defend its empire to the last man. France, as always, played both ally and rival, depending on the day. It was a grand performance, staged for the benefit of the public, while behind the curtain, exhaustion threatened to bring the whole production crashing down. By late 1748, it was clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The Caribbean theater had become a stalemate. Forts and islands changed hands, but the overall balance of power remained unchanged. In Europe, the constant back-and-forth battles left everyone too drained to continue. The War of Jenkins' Ear, once a fiery rallying cry, was now a footnote in a much larger conflict. The only question left was how to end it without admitting just how pointless it had all been. By early 1748, both Britain and Spain were staggering under the sheer weight of the war. What had begun nearly a decade earlier with a severed ear and a lot of patriotic shouting had turned into a grinding stalemate. The Caribbean, once a theater of daring raids and ambitious conquests, now resembled a gigantic, sweltering waiting room where both sides sat glaring at each other across mosquito-infested waters, too exhausted to move but too proud to leave. For Britain, the problems were everywhere and nowhere. The Royal Navy was stretched to its limits, maintaining blockades, escorting convoys, and occasionally fighting the French whenever they decided to pop out of nowhere like uninvited dinner guests. Supplies were a nightmare. Ships arrived a little late, full of spoiled rations and half-dead crews. Soldiers who managed to land on shore often found that their muskets didn't work properly thanks to damp gunpowder. It was less a war effort and more a traveling circus of logistical disasters. Spain's situation wasn't much better. Its empire remained vast, but brittle. Defending it required juggling limited resources across thousands of miles of ocean. Every fort, every port, every colony cried out for reinforcements. Havana wanted more ships, Cartagena needed more troops, and Veracruz demanded more money. Madrid tried to provide everything at once, and predictably, everyone ended up dissatisfied. To make matters worse, the Spanish bureaucracy was legendary for its slowness. Orders took weeks or even months to reach the Caribbean, by which time the situation on the ground had completely changed. There are records of one Spanish garrison receiving instructions to prepare for an attack. 6 months after the attack had already happened. And yet, despite these problems, the Spanish defenders held firm. The psychological boost of Cartagena's earlier victory still lingered. Spanish soldiers had become experts at using their home field advantage, the climate, the terrain, even the bugs to wear down their enemies. Their strategy was simple: don't let Britain win fast, and sooner or later Britain will run out of money, men, or patience. They weren't wrong. Britain's financial situation was dire. War costs had ballooned beyond imagination. Taxes were raised again and again. leading to unrest at home. Merchants complained loudly about lost profits and captured ships. Some even began quietly pressuring the government to seek peace, worried that endless conflict would destroy the very trade routes they were fighting to control. In Parliament, tempers flared. Politicians screamed across the aisles, accusing each other of treason, incompetence, or both. One particularly memorable session reportedly ended with 2 MPs dueling in a field the next morning, though both missed every shot and went home embarrassed. The public, once fired up about Jenkins' ear, was now simply tired. Newspapers that had once printed stirring accounts of heroic naval victories now published gloomy essays about the rising price of bread. Ordinary citizens began asking uncomfortable questions like, wait, why are we still fighting this war, and who exactly is Captain Jenkins again? Even the soldiers in the field seemed to lose track of what the war was about. A British lieutenant wrote in his diary, "Today we fought the Spanish for control of a hill. Tomorrow, we will likely fight them again for the same hill. If we capture it a third time, perhaps we can name it Jenkins's Hill and be done with it." As exhaustion set in, the pace of fighting slowed. Battles became rare. Small skirmishes fought more out of stubbornness than strategy. The heat, disease, and endless monotony sapped everyone's will to fight. Mosquitoes continued their relentless campaign, claiming far more lives than musket balls ever did. There was even a strange, unspoken détente at times. In certain areas, British and Spanish troops developed informal truces. They'd shout insults during the day, then quietly exchange goods at night, British rum for Spanish tobacco, or even just news from home. These brief moments of humanity were quickly squashed by commanders if discovered, but they hinted at how weary the soldiers had become. Meanwhile, in Europe, the grander war of Austrian succession dragged on with equal futility. Huge armies marched back and forth across the continent, trading cities and victories like poker chips. Every gain in one region seemed to be offset by a loss somewhere else. Diplomats in various courts began whispering that perhaps it was time to end this madness before all of Europe collapsed under the strain. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. It was a delicate dance of egos and interests. No one wanted to admit defeat. No one wanted to give up too much. The challenge was finding a way for everyone to claim victory while actually achieving very little. By mid-1748, these negotiations began to bear fruit. Peace talks were scheduled to take place in the Dutch city of Aix-la-Chapelle, now Aachen, Germany. The name alone suggested elegance and diplomacy, though one British observer snidely remarked, "It is a fine place to talk endlessly without deciding anything." As the year wore on, both armies and navies started to pull back. There was little point in launching new offensives when diplomats were already carving up the map. Soldiers noticed the change immediately. Orders became less aggressive, patrols grew lazier, and the tone shifted from fight to the death to try not to cause trouble before the treaty is signed. For the men on the ground, it was an odd, anticlimactic feeling. They had endured years of hardship, only to see the war slowly fizzle out like a damp firecracker. When word of the impending peace finally reached the Caribbean, reactions were mixed. Some British soldiers celebrated wildly, eager to go home. Others were bitter, feeling that their sacrifices had been wasted. Spanish troops were equally divided, relieved the fighting was ending, but wary of what the treaty might bring. What no one knew yet was just how little the treaty would actually change. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was meant to bring clarity to the chaos. Instead, it became one of those diplomatic agreements where everyone pretended to win, no one admitted to losing, and almost nothing actually changed. It was the perfect ending to a war that had started over a single, unlucky year. Representatives from all the major powers gathered in the elegant Dutch city of Aix-la-Chapelle in the spring of 1748. The setting was serene cobblestone streets, charming canals, and just enough fine wine to keep tempers manageable. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was tense. Britain, Spain, France, Austria, and a host of other nations all had competing interests, grudges, and lists of demands. For weeks, the talks dragged on. Delegates delivered long speeches filled with flowery language, then stormed out to complain about each other in private. At one point, a Spanish diplomat reportedly fell asleep during a particularly dull British proposal and had to be nudged awake by his assistant. Another time, the French envoy was so frustrated that he accidentally spilled an entire glass of wine on his Austrian counterpart's papers. Despite the theatrics, everyone knew the truth. The war had exhausted them all. France was broke. Britain was buried in debt. Spain was stretched to its limits. Even Austria, supposedly the war's central player, was running on fumes. There was no appetite left for grand campaigns or decisive battles. The final terms of the treaty were underwhelming, to put it kindly. Britain agreed to return any territory it had captured from Spain, and Spain did the same in reverse. In other words, both sides basically hit the reset button. The Caribbean looked almost exactly the same on the map after 9 years of fighting as it had before the first cannonball was fired. Cartagena, Havana, and other Spanish strongholds remained firmly under Spanish control. Britain held on to a few minor gains, but nothing remotely close to the grand visions that had fueled the early years of the war. Even worse, the original issues that sparked the conflict, smuggling, trade disputes, and maritime rights were never fully resolved. They were simply papered over with vague promises to negotiate later. It was a peace deal designed to save face, not to fix problems. When news of the treaty reached London, the reaction was muted. There were no cheering crowds this time, no bells ringing in triumph. The public had grown cynical. After years of heavy taxes, dead sons, and soaring bread prices, most people just wanted the war to be over. Even Captain Jenkins, now a largely forgotten figure, reportedly muttered something like, "Well, I suppose that's that," before disappearing from public life entirely. Spain's reaction was similar. While they celebrated the fact that they had successfully defended their Caribbean empire, they couldn't ignore the cost. Entire fleets had been lost, colonial economies were in ruins, and Madrid's treasury was dangerously empty. In the Caribbean itself, the soldiers and sailors who had endured years of misery greeted the peace with a mix of joy and disbelief. Some wept openly at the thought of finally going home. Others simply stared in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend that the endless cycle of raids, battles, and disease was finally over. One British privateer famously declared, "If I never see another mosquito again, it will be too soon." Back home, historians and satirists wasted no time poking fun at the war's absurdity. Pamphlets mocked the idea that so much blood and treasure had been spent over something as trivial as an ear. One cartoon showed a giant ear perched on a throne while tiny soldiers bowed before it, a perfect metaphor for the conflict's ridiculous origins. Even among the political class, there was a sense of quiet embarrassment. The war had begun with bold speeches and lofty promises. It ended with a treaty that changed almost nothing. And yet, in its own strange way, the war had left a lasting mark. It exposed the fragility of empires, the dangers of overconfidence, and the staggering human cost of global conflict. It also served as a grim reminder that wars rarely go according to plan, especially when they're started for reasons that, in hindsight, seem absurd. As the 1750s began, both Britain and Spain turned their attention to rebuilding. Trade slowly resumed. Colonies began to recover. Diplomats went back to their endless rounds of negotiations, this time hopefully without preserved body parts involved. The War of Jenkins's ear faded into the background of history, overshadowed by larger, more dramatic conflicts to come. But for those who had lived through it, the sailors, soldiers, merchants, and yes, even Captain Jenkins himself, it remained a vivid memory of a world gone mad over a single, severed ear. And so, as the sun set on the Caribbean and the last warship sailed home, the world returned to an uneasy peace. It was fragile, temporary, and full of unresolved tensions, but for now, at least, the guns were silent. The wind down was slow, like a gentle tide erasing footprints from the sand. The noise of battle faded, replaced by the quiet lapping of waves and the distant cries of seabirds. For those who had survived, there was relief, but also a hollow ache. Families were reunited. Though many faces were missing from the tables, ships returned to harbor, their sails patched and their decks scarred by years of war. Soldiers laid down their weapons, some vowing never to pick them up again. In Britain, life began to settle back into familiar rhythms, merchants reopening shops, farmers tending fields, children playing in the streets. The Caribbean, too, slowly healed. Forts were repaired, ports reopened, and trade resumed, cautious but determined. No one could undo the years of hardship, nor could they forget the absurd chain of events that had brought the world to the brink. But they could breathe, rebuild, and hope however faintly that the next war might be avoided. For now, the story was over. No more cannon fire, no more fever-ridden camps, no more pointless battles, just calm seas, quiet nights, and the promise of peace.